Well, Jon is a visiting professor this year at San Francisco Theological Seminary. And Jon, we have really close ties to the seminary. Several of us have graduated from there, and we often are able to have speakers. And I've always enjoyed so much the speakers from the seminary for our adult ed. Um, Jon has taught biblical studies for 30 years, and I have it on good authority that he is a stunningly good teacher. So we are so looking forward to your presentation today and how timely it is in this time as we see so many visuals of people crossing the border and looking for new life and fleeing war-torn areas and poverty and in hope of new beginnings here. So Jon, thank you so much for being with you or with us, and we will send you the recording when we're finished so that you can have it for yourself.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
It's a joy to be with all of you. I have a longer connection with SFTS and several different kinds of connections. That means I've been in your building and on your campus many times and driven by countless times. And this is the first time I have the pleasure to be with you. So been looking forward to this. A lot of what I've been talking about in the last several years has been this connection between Bible and immigration. I think I taught this as a semester-long class at SFTS for the first time in about 2015. It felt timely then. It feels more timely every year that goes by. We see in this country and in this world that immigration has become almost an intractable problem. It has continued as a political issue and as a logistical nightmare through multiple administrations. And it seems to be beyond the ability of our government to make the big steps necessary. And we pray for that to change and to change soon. But the problems are getting wider. We are beginning to see internationally an increasing number of immigrants from a variety of sources. And one of the newest sources is climate change. People whose old homelands, the places where their family has been for generations, have changed to the point where they can't grow crops, or they're now underwater, or they're now too hot and too flammable to live in year-round. I mean, we're seeing that in international places, and we're seeing parts of that very close to home in California. If we continue, our climate practices are going to be an increasing cause of the need for immigration, the displacement that leads to immigration. In this last year of pandemic, it kind of feels for many of us as an anti-immigration.
Yeah, why don't you join without, you can join with video, that's fine.
Greg, could you mute Greg?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
Go ahead, Jon. I don't know.
I have certainly not been living the immigrant lifestyle this year. I've been living a very static, stationary existence Once or twice a month, I get out of the house as briefly as possible. And the immigrant experience is kind of very far from my experience. And yet what we know within the United States is that the number of people who have changed houses since COVID started has been more than the years before. There are people who can't afford to stay where they were before COVID hit. There are people who need to move to take care of relatives during the pandemic. And there are a lot of people, I know a few, but I've been impressed by how hard this year has been. People who have moved to a new town and not met anybody because they can't talk to their neighbors. They don't go to a work or a school setting to see people. This time of sheltering in place has ironically been a time of high movement and a lot of change for people without any of the habits that we're used to having to adapt when we move. So very current things in many directions. But as a biblical scholar, what I see is that
There we go.
these are very, very old issues. And that the Bible as a whole is not only aware of immigration, it's aware of most of the same individual problems, a lot of the circumstances that we are. Immigration can be caused by famine or by weather change that leads to famine. It can be caused by politics and exile and the changing of borders. Immigration can be caused because of linguistic issues. If you live in one area and suddenly your language isn't welcome there anymore, or your ethnicity suddenly isn't welcome there anymore, you are forced into immigration. The same thing that's been happening in so many parts of our country. These are all things that our biblical characters, our ancestors in faith, experienced and dealt with and felt strongly about. Even though we've kind of, in our imagination, depicted them, sometimes depicted all of these different characters over generations and strewn across continents, we've imagined them all as white, just like us. Or we've imagined them as Jewish and indistinguishable from each other. And we haven't realized the diversity and the immigration issues that they were living in the midst of. So just to highlight a few. Adam and Eve, starting things out at the beginning of Genesis, the first humans created, they are given a task to serve the earth. They're placed in one garden, but they're given a job that can't be done until they leave the garden. Their job is to serve the whole earth and tend to all of the animals and plants. And so their story very quickly moves from being in the garden to being sent out to get back to work. And they experienced new areas, unfamiliar areas, challenging areas, and kind of begin that sense of movement. Every generation after Adam and Eve moves to a new country, according to Genesis. Every generation. And then when we get to people like Abraham and Sarah, God finds them where they live, in a place called or a suburb outside and they are told to make a journey to be with God. And that journey takes them not only out of their country, but out of their continent. That journey takes them away from all of their family, takes them away from all of their culture, all of their habits, all of their familiarity, every geographic marker they have ever seen. And it takes them through one land after another where people speak different languages. And in trying to make deals with people who speak different languages, they make a long list of mistakes and get in trouble because they're not proficient enough in the language and the culture to get by. They eventually end up in the area we would call the Palestine area. But even then, they don't stop. They're told they can go out and search for a promised land, but by the end of the story, Abram still doesn't have a home. He has a tent. And he has a lot of places by then that he's familiar with and may feel like home, but he's still not home. His kids grow up and move off in opposite directions to different countries where there are different languages. Abraham would not speak the language of his grandchildren because of immigration. There is that much change going on. Through the next generations, Jacob's generation is hit with famine. And they try everything they can to hold on to their ancestral land and stay where they are, but they end up having to move to Egypt because that's the only place where there's food, the only place nearby that's not affected by the famine. And they end up in a new land on a different continent with people who look very different from them and who speak a completely unrelated language and have a very different culture. And they settle there. So one of the earliest reflections, almost a creedal statement that appears early in Scripture, it is to reflect back on what God has done and say, our father was a wandering Aramean. And that's when we met God. We met God as immigrants. We met God when we were on the move. Moses, in the book of Exodus, Moses grows up in Egypt some generations after Jacob. Moses is Jewish born, but raised in Pharaoh's court. He probably speaks Egyptian better than he speaks Hebrew. And in fact, when God calls him and tells him to be a prophet, one of his excuses is that his Hebrew isn't very good, and that people won't understand him. And God finds a way around that and tells him to go out and get to work anyway, because having some language issues and not being able to speak the same language as the others around you is never an excuse to avoid God's work. It hasn't been an excuse since Moses, not an excuse now. And in Moses's time, God is preparing a salvation for all of the people. I love this story in Exodus and could speak at much greater length, but I'll just say a bit about it. God's vision is that the people can leave Egypt, and they can leave the position of slavery that they held in Egyptian society. That they can all just get up one morning and walk out. All they have to do is be willing to walk out in an unknown direction with no goal in sight, with nothing but what they carry on their backs, and nothing more than a cloud to follow. And a promise that someday they will get to a new place. And as the story goes, someday turns into 40 years and almost nobody survives that long. And it's the next generation that finds what they were promised. But when God constructs a plan to save these Israelite slaves in Egypt, God's plan is immigration. God uses immigration to save people, starting with Moses and the Israelites. Sometimes we think of immigrants even today as people who are unfortunate, who are displaced, who have suffered something, and there's deep truth to that. But according to Exodus, in God's view, the immigrants are the chosen ones whom God is saving. And it's the people who stay at home in their settled lands who are the ones to feel sorry for.
Turning it on its head.
That is a real reversal of how we think about these things. But it is at the heart of the biblical message. The Old Testament, if you've taken the time to read the Old Testament, start to finish, don't do that right now while I'm talking, but afterwards you can. There's a lot of laws, a lot of rules. And so many of those rules make sense in a very different culture than ours, that they're challenging to read and see how they apply. But there are certain of the laws that get repeated over and over. We're familiar with at least two of them. Should be familiar with several, but a couple that get repeated are to take care of widows and to take care of orphans. And those are repeated in the Old Testament and then repeated again in the New Testament. And our Christian tradition has done a very good job of keeping those commands of God in front of us in so many different centuries and nations and denominations. We understand care for widows, care for orphans. And for the most part, we do our work. We take care of that responsibility. We sometimes don't realize how many widows and orphans are among us, and the full range of what they look like. But we know we're supposed to be doing that. But almost every time those two groups, the widows and the orphans, are mentioned together in the Old Testament, there is a third group mentioned in the same sentence. And we've not been very clear about how to translate that. Some translations will call it stranger or alien or foreigner. What it comes down to is immigrant. It's somebody who lives near you but wasn't born near you. And in most cases, that means someone who doesn't look like you. And in most cases, it means someone who doesn't speak your language, at least not as a first language. Not in every case, but most of the cases of these foreigners or strangers are that way. Deuteronomy 10, God commands, love the stranger because you were strangers in Egypt. Our response, I mean, as Presbyterians, we're told that worship and obedience are the proper responses to experiencing God's grace. They are not obligations or chores to be performed. They're just the result of a glad heart that's glad because we recognize what God has done for us. The same way in the Old Testament, people remember that we come from families of slaves. Maybe not recently, maybe not in our own memories, or maybe that's the way we grew up. But no matter how far away in history that experience is, even if it hasn't happened to us since our ancestors in Egypt, we remember. And because of that, we treat strangers, foreigners, and immigrants better than any other country in the world. Because God saved us when we were immigrants, and we show our respect for God's salvation by being good to the immigrants where God is working today. If God saved us through migration as Jews from Egypt, who are we to say that the immigrants of today aren't the people whom God is saving right now? And of course, we should help them. Leviticus takes it a little further and says that the alien, a slightly different translation, who resides among you. So I think, again, an immigrant who is living in your area shall be the same to you as a citizen. And it's repeated several times that citizens and non-citizens alike in ancient Israel operate under the same legal protections. That is a more progressive law coming out of the ancient world than anybody else in the ancient world followed, and it's more progressive than any nation I know of right now. And it is basic and repeated in our ethics of the Old Testament. Treat immigrants the same way you treat citizens. You could go on to Jesus's statement about treating everybody the way you wish to be treated, but if that's too abstract for you, just start out with treat immigrants the same as full citizens. That's concrete. It's hard to do in our legal system. It's not legal in our country to do this work that Scripture demands. Isaiah takes it a little further. Apparently, there were some people who said, okay, if these immigrants can be treated like full citizens and can live among us, there are still things that aren't quite right for them to do. I mean, they don't understand all of our traditions. They don't have the experience we do or the legacy we do. They're at best first generation worshipers of God, not the multi-generation that we sometimes value in our religious groups. But what Isaiah says is a direct message of God, is foreigners who join themselves to God should be ministers. That is, these immigrants And according to scripture, there's no such thing as an illegal immigrant because we treat every immigrant as if they were legal citizens, no matter what. These immigrants are good people to have as our religious leaders. And they are people who know in their own lives the experience of being saved by God. And so they are good teachers and good examples for those of us who have been more settled. Jesus, of course, teaches the Old Testament very well, and is very aware from the time he was a child of all of these sayings and stories and lives them out. Jesus does not show preference to those who grew up in Israel versus those who grew up in other countries and continents. And Jesus's followers are full of people from all over the earth. People who have legal status in the places where Jesus works and people who don't. People who are considered honorable and people who are from countries who are considered very disreputable in their culture. And Jesus embraces them. It's, when we talk about ethnicities and national origins, we have a lot of kinds of prejudice in our country, but prejudice against Syro-Phoenicians is not something that we spend a lot of time dealing about. That's not one of our current racial problems. That was a big problem in Jesus's day. And when a Syro-Phoenician woman came up to Jesus and touched him, people said, "You can't allow that. They do not deserve you." And Jesus kept breaking those cultural barriers in almost every chapter of the New Testament. Jesus put together disciples from different countries. And in one of those passages that we do very well to remember, where Jesus, in this very elaborate scene, imagines a time when everybody is called to account and divided between those who have loved Jesus and those who haven't. And the surprise in the passage is how many opportunities we've had to love Jesus, and some of us weren't looking. I mean, it says, you loved me when I was hungry and you gave me food. You loved me when I was thirsty and you gave me to drink. You loved me when I was an immigrant and you welcomed me into your house. Jesus lifts up this love of immigrants as just as important to basic human life as food and water, and just as basic a way to show people your love and your love for Jesus. I think Jesus knew a lot about this, not just from reading scripture, but from his own experience. Jesus, we're told, was conceived up north in Galilee. Galilee was a territory occupied by the Roman Empire. And then by government decree, everyone was forced back to their ancestral lands. A massive displacement. And Jesus was born as one of those displaced persons in the old ancestral hometown of Bethlehem, And when we sing about Bethlehem, it's usually about how nice and wonderful it is there, and wouldn't it be great to be born there, and it'd be just a fun place to visit, and it's calm and quiet. No, it's a war-torn place. And there was no room for Jesus or for any of those others who are immigrating from an occupied area. And then the government declares it illegal to be Jewish. And for Jewish boys under the age of 2, it's not only illegal, but it's punishable by the death penalty. And so Jesus and his parents flee. They leave the country, they walk across the desert, they end up in a new continent in Egypt because the powers that have made it illegal to be an immigrant and illegal to be Jewish can't chase them all the way to Egypt. So they grow up. Jesus grows up in a land where his parents don't speak the language. Jesus grows up in a household where they can't make the food that his parents are used to eating because you can't get those materials and ingredients where they're living. Jesus grows up on a street with no kids who look like him. And they didn't have much on that street. People came having been displaced. Where Jesus grew up probably looks more like one of our modern day refugee camps than anything else we can remember. And the kids who we sometimes see crying in those places are one of the best images for Jesus's childhood that we're going to come across. Politics changed. It was safe for Jesus and the family to move back into the Nazareth area. At some point, we know that Jesus has grown up. It's not really sure what year. He may be as young as 8. He may be as old as 12 when they move. But he's somewhere in that, 3rd to 7th grade age range. Your experience may vary, but my experience in trying to convince grade school kids and teenagers that moving across country is a good thing for the family, I've never been able to sell anybody on that. I'm sure Jesus was more good-natured a child than ours were, but I don't think he was easy to get along with in this move. He would go to a place where people spoke the language that his parents did, but they didn't speak the language that he had grown up speaking. I think the rest of Jesus's life, people thought Jesus spoke with a funny accent. Because if you grow up speaking Egyptian until you're 8 or 12, you're always going to sound like Egyptian's your first language, even if you get very fluent in another language. That's some of the prejudice that we make immigrants go through for decades. And Jesus would have faced that. As well as people wondering why he had lived in Egypt. I mean, Egypt is an enemy. Where are your allegiances, really? I think those sorts of prejudices Jesus would have experienced. And even when he stopped being a child, that doesn't go away. You know from reading the Gospels, we know that there are people who are questioning whether Jesus is valid as a religious leader because of where he grew up. As it turns out, Nazareth wasn't a very high-class place either. And so whether people thought Jesus was Egyptian because of how he spoke or from Nazareth because of where the family lived lately, he was still considered foreign in the land of Israel itself. And he was still considered an other who may not have a right to speak. And he was not considered a citizen because citizens in the Roman Empire and the Jewish kingdom under Roman Empire, citizens were not subject to the death penalty. And Jesus was. He was treated not as a citizen, but as an immigrant his entire life. He gathered around him a group of disciples who were multicultural, multi-geographic, almost certainly multilingual. Again, the Gospels go to great lengths to tell us geographic information about where all these people are from, but the places don't mean much to us anymore, so we just kind of skip over that instead of realizing what it's telling us. All these people are immigrants. These people come from groups of people who don't get along. There are blood feuds between these people, and Jesus puts them all together and expects them to live to a higher purpose. And then I think one of the mysteries of our faith is why the Spirit didn't come fully while Jesus was still around, or for about 2 months after Jesus was gone. But the truth is that as long as the people were mostly Judean, and most of them could speak Hebrew or Aramaic, the Spirit didn't come. On Pentecost, when thousands had gathered representing every known country in the world, and when communication came to a complete stop because not enough people spoke any languages in common, that was when the Spirit came. That was when the church started. In the Bible, there is no such thing as a monocultural, monolingual church. There never was. There never will be. Every church we see from Acts until the end of Revelation is multilingual because every church is welcoming of immigrants and every church is multicultural. So this is a strong biblical tradition from start to finish. That the love of the immigrant, the acceptance of the immigrant with full citizenship rights, the inclusion of immigrants in every part of our faith experience, the appreciation of what immigrants can teach all of us about how God's love changes lives, are core to Judaism and Christianity and Islam alike. But have not always been valued. And we have sometimes been slow to think about the hospitality shown to strangers or immigrants in the Bible and to see that as an ethical imperative for those of us who would call ourselves part of this tradition. I think with that, I can take a breath, and maybe there's some time for questions or discussion.
Wow, so much to think about. Cynthia, did you want to facilitate this, or would you like me to call on Chitoka?
You go ahead. You go ahead.
Chitoka?
Yes, thank you. Professor Berquist, I did have a question. Well, first I would like to say thank you, thank you, thank you. One of the questions that I had is, considering that this is a biblical tradition and going all the way back to the beginning of time, catching up with the time that we're in now, and referring to immigrants as being illegal, referring to immigrants as being non-citizens. Can you give me some kind of idea or image where it shifted? Or what era did it shift in?
Well, I would say that among Israel's neighbors, even back that far ago, the traditional customs were to be good to your own family and not so good to everybody else, and to distrust the stranger and exclude the immigrant. That's what was in everybody else's law. That's what was in everybody else's practices and culture. And I probably shouldn't be lumping 3,000 years of human history across the globe together like this, but a whole lot of the cultures in world history have been resistant to immigrants, or have been xenophobic, or have not appreciated the stranger. I think at different times in our Jewish, Christian, and Muslim tradition, we've done better than others at welcoming others as equals. And at other times we have done poorly, and sometimes it's just been awful. To some extent, maybe I'm thinking we need to choose. We have this 3,000-year history of inclusion, and there's a 3,000-year history or more of exclusion that, as citizens of the world, we've also inherited. And it's woven together inside all of us. But we have a choice to make. Which of those inheritances we will live out of, which we will claim. And really, it's a daily choice. It's a person by person choice. Do I see the person as God's creation, as God's beloved, as someone who carries God's DNA? Do I treat them the way I want to be treated? Or do I let our differences get in the way and disrespect them and devalue them because we aren't identical? So maybe it's not an issue of when in history did we go wrong? How long have we gotten it wrong? But what are you going to do next?
I see Ralph's hand.
I have really appreciated what you have shared. There's a phrase that I'm taken from Marcus Borg, and he spoke of the conventional wisdom, which in biblical times was purity rights and who's in and who's out. So it was exclusion, versus the radical wisdom of Jesus that was radically inclusive. And I love that. But what you've done is to give us 3,000 years of my Judeo-Christian history that said, oh yeah, that Marcus Borg was more than right. We've had these things in our tradition for so many centuries. So thank you very much.
As much as I appreciate Marcus Borg, he was not the first one to think these things. And I'm pretty sure that Jesus would have said, I'm just telling you what I read in the book. Is that radical wisdom? Well, in our context, in this culture, yes, it is radical wisdom.
Anyone else? Olivia. Welcome, Olivia.
Thank you. It's such a privilege to hear you preach, Dr. Berquist, and share some insights that were just so new to me and mind-blowing. I think it might have been you or something I read that said the word for Hebrew is traveler. Do you have any thoughts on that or reflections or anything?
Yes, the word Hebrew is a name that comes from a verb that means to cross over. When people talk about over there, like across the river, that's using the same phrase that gave Hebrews their name. Hebrews are people who have crossed over. They are boundary crossers. And that's a core part of the identity. The Jewish community is still better at remembering that they were slaves in Egypt and God brought them out and God made them cross over and gave them the name of the people who had crossed over, crossed out of slavery and into what felt like a desert wilderness and became a promised land. The early church would talk about itself as ecclesia, the people who were called out. And I think that is something of the same sense as crossed over. It's not at the Red Sea, God picked people up and drug people across an imaginary line and they crossed over. In the early church, it wasn't quite like that, but some people heard the call of God that went out to all people, and they left the kind of life they were in, and they participated in a community of other people who were called out of that culture. not away from the culture, but called to be countercultural. And so I think our root understanding of church from the New Testament's not that different than this idea of being the travelers, the sojourners, the ones who are crossed over.
Thank you so much. I mean, this is just fabulous. So good.
Thank you.
Susan Esler.
Is it too simplistic to think that maybe the thread running through this immigration problem that we have is the fear of not having enough? Is there enough? How can I share with the people I love and still share with all these people coming in?
Mm-hmm.
Is that the common denominator of this problem?
Oh, I think it is. It is a very common thread that runs through most of this. It may not be the only thing that ties these different stories together, but when I think about Jacob's family going to Egypt, did the Egyptians think we've been saving up this food for ourselves and there's only so much of it? Why should we give it to others? Did they have some fear that there wouldn't be enough to go around? Elijah, the prophet in the Old Testament, deals frequently with people's fears that there's not enough. He'll stay for a while with a widow who is poor and doesn't know where there's food for her children to come. And yet every day when she goes to the jar of grain, there is still enough left. And Elijah keeps saying that this is a matter of faith. That by giving to others, we will find that we have enough for ourselves. In today's economics, that's very hard to believe. It's very hard to trust and live out. But living without that fear is one of the keys. Let me get personal and say I live in fear of things running out. And I wish I could save up more to make sure that my family will be taken care of and the next generation, and that I would be able to fund the institutions I treasure, and that leads to this sense of I wish I had so much more. I'm scared of it running out. But there are things that scare me more. One is that as I look at world history, exclusive cultures, xenophobic cultures, cultures that hated the others across the borders, have all died out. They are not sustainable. And if I want to live in a culture that will be sustained, if I want some of this culture to be left for my kids, this needs to be an open culture and an inclusive culture, because the world has never let any of the others live.
Hmm.
This is something I'll have to, because of the limit of time, ask you to take my word for, but I have studied the connection between US immigration policy and the US economy. Every time that the US tightens the borders and immigration drops, within a generation, there results a crushing depression or recession. Closing the borders hurts everybody. Not necessarily right away, but within a generation, within 25 years. And I care what happens to people I love 25 years from now. The times when we have opened the borders the most, granted citizenship the most widely, have resulted in multiple decades of growth and economic expansion. So we see that within the US economy, as capitalist and xenophobic as it can be sometimes. But those are basic principles of human life that keep repeating. If we shut people out or live with the kinds of inequalities that we put up with, it is not healthy for any of us. And so that scares me more. When I look at human history, I see that if I try to hoard everything for myself, everything I value will be gone in a couple decades. But if I try to live an inclusive life that values others and takes care of immigrants and strangers and a whole lot of other people, then we have a chance of a better life ahead. And I can say that just from studying world history and economics. For me, the Bible gives me the theological grounding in why that happens. It's because God has made us to love the world as much as God loves this wide and wild world. And when we love this world, things go better.
That's the message.
Well, Jon, I'm so grateful. We are all so grateful for your candidness and for your teaching this morning. I want to respect your time. And Sally, great to have you here and some of your students. Thank you so, so much. You may hear from us again.
Well, I do know where you all live.
Yeah.
And I will be in your area as soon as travel allows, and look forward to more times in person one way or another.
Sounds fabulous. Will you let us know when you're going to be up here?
I will.
Thank you. Or we'll just keep checking with you. How's that?
And that works too.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Jon.
Thank you.
Blessings to all of you today, and we'll gather again next week.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
Hi, Nancy.